Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Hello YouTube. Today I'm going to start a new series on the history of Islamic law in general, but specifically on the history of the Hanafi school of Islamic thought, or the Hanafi Madhhab, named after its founder Abu Hanifa. It was more than just Abu Hanifa that created the founding of this, legal school of thought, but we'll get into that later. But it's named after Abu Hanifa, so therefore it's called the Hanafi Madhhab, and I have some Hanafi books behind me. This is kind of like, I've made it my Hanafi bookshelves. So here we have Kitab al-Asl lil-Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani. So Abu Hanifa's most famous students were Abu Yusuf and Muhammad Shaybani. And this here in modern print is a 12-volume book. I mean, the first volume is just like the introduction, so you could say an 11-volume book. And it's likely the oldest extant Islamic legal text ever written. So the oldest book that we have in Islamic law is this big, massive. Okay, when you translate it to English, it's usually double the amount of volumes. So if you can say this is 11 volumes, it'd be 22 volumes in English. And just underneath it, we have Hashiyat ibn Abidin, who is the modern hugest authority, you might say, on the Hanafi Madhhab. He has his famous hyper commentary here, and he dates Kitab al-Asl as being the first book that Muhammad Shaybani ever wrote. Now he's got other ones like al-Jami' al-Kabir, al-Jami' al-Saghir, and the Siyar and other things here, but this was the first. And for me, I think that's amazing, and that goes to show you how rich the Islamic tradition is, how rich Islamic law is, and really Islamic law is the epitome of Islamic civilization, if you will. I also have, various other Hanafi texts here, which we could get more into that later. But I kind of want to give an introduction as to how, you might say Islamic law began, or the formative period of Islamic law, what happened, what went on, and why it's relevant to things now. Why do we care about this history? Why does it matter, not just for practicing Muslims, but the rest of the world, to all of humanity? Why is this important? And so I want to start with a quote from Western scholar on Islamic law. His name is Aron Zysow, and this is his quote, and I'll read it to you. At the heart of Islamic law, as all other legal orders, there lies the question of legitimacy. From where do rules that purport to bind Muslims come? What is the source of their validity? What is the source of their validity? Who is entitled to make authoritative pronouncements as to the content of the law? What are the standards for resolving disagreement as to the law? From a very early period, for which reasons we are free to speculate, Muslims came to treat questions of legitimacy along explicitly epistemological lines. This concern with legitimacy in institutional terms, its constant preoccupation with epistemology, makes Islamic law much more self-conscious than either of these two systems, and for those of a philosophical bent, much more sophisticated. And so this fancy term epistemology, it will definitely get thrown around a lot in this series, so I kind of want to give a little bit of an explanation as to what it is for those who maybe don't read philosophy or don't know much about philosophy. So essentially, and I'm just kind of trying my best to translate it into my own terms, into layman terms, but epistemology is kind of like saying, what is knowledge? Epistemology is the study of knowledge, or how do we define knowledge, or how do we come to know? Okay, it's a way of saying what is evidence, what is truth. Okay, how do we know what's true? How do we access knowledge? That's what epistemology basically is about. And so I do have a little bit of a script here, or at least something roughly that I'm going to read and follow, kind of like most of my videos. And so amongst contemporary Hanafis, there is a debate which recently emerged about what really was the true early Hanafi legal theory, Uṣūl al-Fiqh, that was espoused by the eponymous Abu Hanifa in a revisionist manner. An Uzbeki British Shaykh, Atabek Shukurov, and Nafasi, took the banner of true early Hanafi legal theory and wrote a book to clarify Abu Hanifa's epistemology for hadith criticism entitled Hanafi Principles of Testing Hadith, Uṣūl al-Hanafiyya li Naqd al-Hadith. However, the response from the late traditionalist Hanafis was swift and brutal, saying the only thing worthwhile in the book is its binding and the quality of paper used. Okay, so that's a pretty harsh criticism here. And really, when it comes to this particular book, I'm actually friends with the author. I've read quite a lot of books regarding the Hanafi Madhhab, secondary literature written by Arab scholars as well as primary sources. And I've read a lot of Uṣūl fiqh books in the Hanafi Madhhab. I've gone over some with teachers and, from within the tradition. So not only do I have the historically trained part from the University of Chicago, but I also have it from within the tradition. I live in both worlds. And what I can say is that this book it does actually take from the Hanafi Uṣūl books, and it is, in my opinion, closer to what the original Hanafis were trying to do. However, as we will see, the Hanafi Madhhab from the very beginning was split. You had some of them who were more rational, and you might say anti-hadith, or they weren't as textual. And you had some that leaned more towards the Ahl al-Hadith, which we'll get to later, and they were more textual and they were less rationalistic. So there's always been a divide, but I would say the dominant group for the longest time was the more rational. And so with that book there, I do really think that it is closer to the Hanafi, original Hanafi hadith criticism. However, looking at that quote there that was so polemic there, if we look at that, it's from a book review, okay? And I printed it out here. I don't know if you guys can see that there. Printed it out so you can go take a look at it. I'll put a link to this book review in the description below. I put a lot of good stuff below in the descriptions of my videos, so please check it out. You can also check out down there's a link for my Patreon, so you can help me keep making such nice videos. But the first thing with this book review that was written here is you go to the bibliography, and to be frank, it's pretty scant. And I spoke with the author, who commented on the book from Shukurov, and they used a lot more sources, primary sources, okay? So here we have Abu Yusuf, Kitab al-Athar. I have that right here. It's kind of a collection of hadith along with opinions from, Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, Muhammad al-Shaybani, okay? It's not really a Uṣūl fiqh book. It doesn't really tell you all that much about early Hanafi legal epistemology, but it has clues. We have Kashf al-Asrar, okay, that's a Uṣūl fiqh book there. Fath al-Bari, okay, commentary on Bukhari, the hadith collection Bukhari. Then we have the Muwatta of Malik ibn Anas. We get Ta'wilat Ahl al-Sunnah from Imam Maturidi, okay. Doesn't, from what I understand, doesn't tell you a whole lot about Uṣūl al-Fiqh. He's got one, Mirqat al-Mafatih, Sharh Mishkat al-Musabih. So that's from Al-Qari. So Mullah Ali bin Sultan Al-Qari. Okay. الشطغامي مفيد الرحمن الوردة الحاضرة في أحاديث تلامذ. There's not even proper transliteration here. الإمام الأعظم والأحاديث العلماء الأحناف الجامع أهل الصحيح للإمام البخاري. Okay. التحاوي. So شرح معاني الأحثار. I got that one right here. Then he cites Turkmani, his nice new book دراسة في علوم الحديث على منهج الحنفية, which I also have. It's kind of scant, and there's not really Uṣūl al-Fiqh books mentioned here. There's a lot of Uṣūl al-Fiqh books in the Hanafi tradition, a lot of them. Probably my favorite is Uṣūl al-Bazdawi over here, Uṣūl al-Bazdawi. But there's so many, and why aren't they cited? And this just seems to be kind of a polemical little book review here that is really kind of biased, kind of just citing, hadith collections and things like that, and it's not very historical, and he didn't use the Uṣūl books. And if you actually go and look at the Uṣūl books of the Madhhab, you would find it coincides more with Shukurov's book. So I just wanted to state that this is why. This type of research is critical even to Muslims now, to muftis, to practicing Hanafis all across the world, because this is still an ongoing debate. Okay. So what this says to the academic or the historian is that Muslims are still conducting genealogies of their early history to authenticate and change their religion to fit the contemporary context. And thus, old debates are invoked. For both Muslims and or Occidental academics, the legal epistemology of early Islamic legal school, known as the Ahl-Ra'i, is not entirely understood or still debated, nor the founding fathers of the Hanafi school that was to emerge therefrom. Current Occidental research seems to have a basic understanding, albeit convoluted, of the Ahl-Ra'i's legal epistemology, generally speaking, and that of the early Hanafis. However, it is grossly myopic due to the fact that they ignore a crucial text that testifies to the legal epistemologies of the time period, 7th to the 9th century, respectively. And that is Kitab al-Asl, right here, of Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani, who lived from 749, 850 to 850 Gregorian. And he is the famous student of Abu Hanifa. So Kitab al-Asl is a 12-volume book in modern print, which is the magnum opus of Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani. It is written as a dialectic between Abu Hanifa and Shaybani, and often passages are merely Shaybani describing the law, or may be written in the form of a debate between Shaybani and others. This book can inform us immensely, not only regarding early Islamic law, but also about socio-political history of the time in which it was written. For reasons I cannot discern, different scholars here, Wael Hallaq, Christopher Melchert, Sadiqi, Schacht, Vikur, Vishnov, and others do not consult Kitab al-Asl in their research. Kitab al-Asl has the potential to refute or confirm any of their claims about early Islamic law. And this is more strange because they will base everything they know about the early Hanafis myopically on smaller works from Shaybani, like Kitab al-Athar, right here, or his version of the Muwatta. In examining the secondary literature, I first tried to give a survey of current scholarship, and second, my own analysis thereof. So what I'm going to do with this video series here is I'm going to talk about, in general, things about Islamic history, when it comes to early Islamic law, some of the current research that's been done, and I hope to demonstrate that in early Islamic legal thought, there was competing notions as to what constituted prophetic sunnah. In other words, different groups or different madhahib, if you will, different schools of thought, they kind of had different ideas as to what the word sunnah meant. And the word sunnah, it's a pre-Islamic Arab word that meant the example of kind of like a great elder or chieftain or something like that, that was to be followed in some way. And it was kind of a loosey-goosey word that was defined differently by different people, and it wasn't until later that it started getting a much more narrow and confined term. Of course, looking at it from the Muslim perspective, the theological perspective of a believer, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, they had a clear understanding as to what the word sunnah meant. I'm not sure if they used the word a whole lot, preserved what we have from written text now. But when it came to the Umayyad period, when it expanded so greatly, and the Abbasid period, I mean, the Sahaba, when they were alive, they were the scholars. You know, they knew way more than the other converted Muslims. And the other converted Muslims probably didn't use these terms all in the same way. And so Arabic is more than just Islamic Arabic, if you will. A lot of the words that we consider as Islamic words in Arabic, they started out, you know, as words that were not Islamic, if you will. And so people still used them in colloquial versions like sunnah, besides just the religious iteration of that word. And so I also want to show with this video series how the early Hanafis emerged most prominently from the Ahl Ra'i camp. Their opponents in legal epistemology were the Ahl al-Hadith, people of Hadith. Ahl means people, and Hadith, talking about prophetic traditions as narrations. Ahl Ra'i, it means to give your legal opinion based on ijtihad. So it was originally Ra'i al-Ijtihad, it just became shortened to Ra'i. So Ra'i and ijtihad, they're kind of interchangeable. So it's ijtihad is the exertion of a jurist, you know, with his mind to come up with a ruling. And so they're more or less interchangeable. But I postulate that many of the polemical writings from the Ahlul Hadith against the Ahlul Ra'i, they likely had tacit theological undertones. They weren't always so much about the actual fiqh or the Islamic law. Sometimes they were writing polemics, even though they might be using vocabulary from Islamic law or fiqh. They were writing these polemics against the Hanafis, often because the Hanafis did not have the same theology as them. In the early period, there was lots of different competing theologies that existed, and there were a lot of Hanafis that were not from what would be called today Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. There were a lot of them who were Mu'tazili, or Jahmi, or Murji'ah, and these different things. And it wasn't until after the Mihna, the Inquisition that happened during the Abbasid period, that many of those people became weeded out of the Hanafi Madhhab, if you will. And then later on, you also had Imam Maturidi, who was a theologian equal to Ash'ari, and you know, was a mutakallim, a theologian in what they call kalam. And so a lot of Hanafis began to adopt that. Some of them adopted more of like a Ahlul Hadith type creed or theology, much like Imam al-Tahawi. His, Al-Aqidah Tahawiyya is still one of the most widely taught book in the Islamic world on theology. And, that was written by the famous Hanafi al-Tahawi. So there was a lot going on theologically with the early Hanafis, and I think a lot of what the Ahlul Hadith wrote against the Hanafis often had theological undertones, even though that was not explicitly stated. Also, I hope that with this video series we can read passages from Kitab al-Uṣūl together here, and showing how they can further give us understanding as to what was going on in that historical time period, as to what early Hanafi legal thought looked like, and just Uṣūl fiqh in general before Shafi'i. And I think what's very evident from Kitab al-Uṣūl is that Shaybani marks an epistemic shift from Abu Hanifa in accepting more hadiths, particularizing the general much more than Abu Hanifa did, which is opposed to Vikor, who implies the Hanafi founding fathers differed only very little, but they actually differed quite a bit. Kitab al-Uṣūl also, in every chapter, gives the usul, singular for usul, the basis for the various rulings found therein, and sometimes an explicit legal epistemology. Since Shaybani was the teacher of the eponymous Imam Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, it could possibly be that Shafi'i's inspiration for writing his famous Kitab al-Risala was from Shaybani's particularization, shift towards reliance on hadith, and explications of the underpinning epistemology behind his rulings. And even if you look at the Fihrist of Ibn Nadim, he does say that Muhammad al-Shaybani had an Uṣūl al-Fiqh book, but it did not survive history and it no longer exists. So we know pretty clearly that there existed an Uṣūl al-Fiqh text that was Hanafi before Shafi'i's Kitab al-Risala. There's also a lot of evidence that the Mu'tazila and their discussions played a key role in a lot of the discussions that we find in Uṣūl al-Fiqh books today. They were the first ones to talk about am wa khas, the general and specific, and many of these discussions that we find in Uṣūl al-Fiqh now. And perhaps Shafi'i's Kitab al-Risala was largely to respond to his former teacher, al-Shaybani, and his other teacher, Imam Malik, as well as the Ahl al-Hadith camp. So these are the different people that he was talking to, his audience, when he wrote that book. Moreover, Kitab al-Uṣūl shows a more systematic and thought-out legal epistemology in early Hanafism than is reflected in current scholarship by the Western Academy. Okay, meaning Orientalists or historians of Islam trained through the Western system. There is explicit notions of analogical reasoning, qiyas, and istihsan, juristic preference, that's found in this book, which largely confirm Wael Hallaq's thesis about early qiyas and istihsan. Kitab al-Uṣūl also has many hadith that are cited within by Shaybani, which are found in later canonical hadith collections, just showing thus showing earlier historical evidence of their usage and showing that early Hanafis did actually use hadith literature quite extensively. So, there's this claim by many Orientalists that the hadiths that we find in the canonical 6 collections today, like Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, and Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, and so on and so forth, these hadiths were made up at a later period. That stuff's dated way after the founding of the 4 madhabs, and therefore in the early period they didn't really use hadith, or they didn't have as many. They were made up at a later date. But actually there's so many hadith in this book, not to mention Kitab al-Athar, or if you look at Musnad Abi Hanifa, there were plenty of hadith. And how could they be made up when they exist in these early texts? Also, if you look at other early hadith collections like Musannif, Abdurrazzaq as-San'ani, or Musannif ibn Abi Shayba, they have a lot of the same hadiths that are found in Kitab al-Uṣūl and Kitab al-Athar, Musnad, Musnad Abi Hanifa, and so on. And so I think that notion kind of needs to be put to rest. Kitab al-Uṣūl is likely the greatest historical source on Abu Hanifa, confirming current scholarship on his legal epistemologies, such as his reliance on local Kufan praxis and preferring the general, more certain sources over the particular form of weaker sources. It is frankly bewildering that this text is not cited or mentioned in secondary literature despite its availability in print since at least 1985. So, Shaykh's book, Muhammadan Jurisprudence, is so famous and had such an impact on Islamic studies in the Western Academy. And in the book, in the introduction, he mentions how he did not have access to this book. It was confiscated by the Egyptian authorities when they took his apartment. Okay. So ever since then, many academics have not used this book because they would look at what did Joseph Schacht cite and go to that primary source instead of digging around themselves for unique primary sources, I guess. This has been neglected all this time. People are not researching this book. I mean, sure, granted it's a big book, it might be intimidating, but it's crucial. And it's pretty well accepted now that Islamic law, the term Islamic law, is a gross misnomer. And I would posit that Islamic law is best understood under the rubric of a ritual system as well as a legal system. It's also an ethical system. In doing so, I'm not implying that Shari'a was never used as a system of physical force by early Muslim polities. It surely was. I am not suggesting that anthropology of law is not useful in analyzing Islamic law versus ritual studies. However, I'm suggesting that Islamic law is very different than Occidental notions of legal codes and systems, and is more akin to Jewish halakha or other religious law systems. Sherman Jackson, is of the opinion that Islamic legal studies in the West has been marred by an overly philosophical lens of analysis which has impeded academics from properly understanding Islamic law. And we can just go back to that quote from the beginning of this video where Aron Zysow says, "For those of a philosophical bent." Okay. Islamic rituals become legalized and laws become ritualized, further blurring such a demarcation. Okay. Moreover, the Shari'a is morality, ethics, and self-care, just as much as it can be classified as law. The distinction between theology and ritual often blurs. One could engage in the ritual of theologizing, and indeed rituals can embody theological notions, like wiping over the Khuffayn. The notion of Islamic law as a code to be applied by a public authority is modern. Classically, Islamic law is much nearer to a process than a code. Ritual is the primary function of Shari'a, the ibadat versus the mu'amalat, and some rituals became enforced and employed by various potentates and polities over the centuries. Law has an entirely different linguistic etymology, as well as intellectual heritage, meaning literally something laid down, that which is fixed or set, whereas Shari'a means the path to water, or the path to that which is good. Much in the same way as the term halakha for Jewish law. Islamic legal epistemologies in particular are not, as it is sometimes suggested, particularly legal in any but a superficial sense. Even close to home, we know that French and German concepts, with their distinctions between la loi and la droit, or das Gesetz and das Recht, do not correspond precisely to the English notion of law. Sorry if I mispronounced the French. In other words, English is largely incapable in our endeavor to produce a representation of that history which not only spoke different languages, but also articulated itself conceptually, socially, institutionally, and culturally in manners and ways vastly different from those material and non-material cultures that produced modernity in its Western linguistic traditions. In other words, English cannot really properly encapsulate the Islamic tradition. And that's kind of well known in traditional circles that you must learn Arabic in order to be a proper student of knowledge. You must learn Arabic in order to be any kind of Shaykh or scholar. And that's also the reason why I tend to use a lot of Arabic words intermixed with my English here. If I use an English word, like kind of just unconsciously without translating it, please do comment below and I'd be happy to translate that for you. Usually I'll translate it just once in the video, and then after that I'll keep using that Arabic word. So when I do translate a word, please perk your ears and pay attention. So law is a category of the English-speaking world, although its history lies in more ancient languages, and we must not assume that it reflects a human universal. That being said, I will use the misnomer Islamic law and various compounds or derivatives from time to time throughout this video series, just due to its normativity, just to make things easy. But do keep in mind that the word is, law does not really fit the Shari'a. So I'm going to try to present, just a general kind of history, show what the current scholarship says about the, socio-political, historical context of, this book, Kitab al-Uṣūl, and the early Hanafis and such. Islam emerged as a seriously political and religious force during the 7th century, as we all know. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself was a known arbitrator, hakam, amongst his people before receiving revelation. After prophethood, the Prophet Muhammad, during the first decade of the Hijrah, appointed tribal arbitrators for disputants to consult. So basically, one of the roles that the Prophet Muhammad played in his society was something of like an arbiter or a lawyer or something of that nature. Okay, besides the other things that he did in society. So that's also important to remember. He was someone who knew about Jewish law, he knew about the Arab customs, he knew Christians, and he knew their law system. And so for him, I think law came very natural. And the first 4 caliphs, the Khulafa Rashidin, wanted to imbue religious sensibilities and social coherence on the newly converted Arabs. With the military expansion of Islam outside the Arabian Peninsula, the caliphs built fortress encampments, garrison towns, amsar, outside of major cities as a pre-modern form of barracks to house the soldiers and their families. Soon, non-military Arabs were to settle there, and eventually those encampments were swallowed up by the large cities adjacent to them. With the influx of Muslim Arabs into new lands, they encountered other religions and cultures. Even the first caliph, Abu Bakr, had ordered his generals to respect conquered people's indigenous laws. Early judges acted as the military commander's assistant and deputy. Some were solely in charge of financing and administration. These early judges also had the role of giving religious lectures for moral edification, muhadarat. These included, but were not limited to, biographies of the prophets and exemplary life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Umar, the second caliph, was known to advise judges to ensure that his ruling conformed with Quranic stipulations, the decisions of the Messenger of God, and those of the just leaders. Umar also imposed laws himself, especially famous was a new penalty for intoxication, and also is reported to have insisted forcefully on the Muslims' adherence to the Quran in matters of ritual, and these became an integral part of the law. While Hallaq also argues that Uthman codified the Quran into a codex, like a modern-looking book, primarily for its legal significance to the caliphate. Hallaq notes that religiously, the most immediate concern for these Muslims was neither theology nor dogma, it's not aqidah, matters that acquired significance only later, but rather the actions through which they realized and manifested obedience to their God in adherence to the Quranic command. In other words, Islam meant, as early as the middle of the 1st century Hijrah, adherence to the will of God as articulated in His book. Thus, it was felt necessary to determine the Quranic stand with regard to a particular issue. Despite signs of religiosity and legalization by the first 3 caliphs, the first official appointment of a judgeship was done by the founder of the Umayyad dynasty, Caliph Muawiyah, around 661 Gregorian. After the generation that encompassed the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, the successors, Tabi'un, who had grown up completely in Islamic intellectual milieu, were the torch-bearers who intelligentsia embarked upon promoting a religious ethos and legal culture, approximately from the years 680 to 708. Already apparent at this time were competing notions as to what constituted Sunnah. The Umayyad Caliph Umar II, from 717 to 719, was the first of the caliphs to collect and act upon textual hadiths. He was the first to commission a hadith collection. However, despite that, he delegated one of his judges to adjudicate in accordance with his ra'i, often translated to discretionary opinion, juristic reasoning, or considered opinion, but was a loose exercise of one's intellect to arrive at some opinion or verdict, some sort of legal opinion. Ra'i was seen to be sunnah itself. In other words, this kind of juristic reasoning was to arrive at what the prophetic example was, or it was the prophetic example in order to use ra'i. And there's a very famous hadith that uses the word ra'i. So the word ra'i actually comes from a prophetic hadith. So this is the hadith that's known as a hadith of ijtihad or qiyas. It's interpreted to mean a proof for qiyas, for making these, analogical deductions here. So I'll read it to you in Arabic. حدثنا هناد حدثنا وكيع عن شعبة عن أبي عون الثقفي عن حارث بن عامر عن رجال من أصحاب معاذ عن معاذ عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بعث معاذ إلى اليمن فقال كيف تقضي؟ فقال أقضي بما في كتاب الله. قال فإن لم تكن في كتاب الله؟ قال فبسنة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. قال فإن لم يكن في سنة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم؟ قال أجتهد رأيي. قال الحمد لله الذي وفق رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. And to say otherwise was to say that the Prophet Muhammad was irrational, a claim that was abhorrent to proponents of ra'i, known as the Ahl-Ra'i. However, already in the 680s, some judges were transmitting hadith literature, originally oral transmissions of stories regarding the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and conceiving of the textual hadith as sunnah in opposition to ra'i. These purporters of hadith texts as sunnah became known as the Ahl al-Hadith, an epistemic dichotomy that would shape Islamic law all the way up until our modern period, and whose name would continue to be appropriated by various revisionist groups in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. Both the Ahl al-Ra'i and the Ahl al-Hadith predominantly functioned in Iraq, especially Kufa and Basra. And Kufa and Basra, they were very strong military, I guess you might say, jumping pads into the conquering of Persia. So these were very well established Muslim areas, Islamic areas, Arab areas. Even though there were Christian speaking people there were people who spoke Assyrian there that were of the Christian community. And so it was not completely homogeneous. That's important to remember. There were Jewish people who spoke Hebrew, and there were Christians who spoke Assyrian. And it was in Iraq where the epistemic schism was the most prominent. The Medinan jurists, including the eponymous Malik, did not fit precisely into either category, but conceived of the Sunnah as the praxis of the Medinan jurists, but also used legal reasoning that was called during that time as ra'i. So it's kind of a little bit blurred for the Malikis. So Dr. Omar Abdullah Wyman Landgraft argues that ra'i meant one thing in Medina and another in Kufa, although it flourished in both centers. Ahmed al-Shamsi appears to imply that ra'i was an import to Medina from Kufi, which predates Malik. The praxis of Medinan jurists was thought to be a transmitted form of consensus, ijma', on legal matters, and each individual praxis was conceived as an enacted hadith. So it wasn't textual, but it was an enactment of the Prophet's example. An enactment of a hadith, okay? If you will. The Ahl Ra'i, from which the eponymous Kufan Abu Hanifa emerged, considered the use of Ra'i as Sunnīic praxis and considered the opinions that Kufan jurists held previously as a precedent, as well as their practice of these legal opinions or non-practice. Al-Awza'i was a Damascene jurist, also a proponent of Ra'i, who held that praxis of the Damascene jurists were a continuous practice constituting the prophetic Sunnah. So Imam Awza'i, he was very much a proponent of custom, a proponent of local custom. However, he was refuted by Abu Yusuf and by Muhammad al-Shaybani because they relied on local practice. Muhammad Shaybani and Abu Yusuf both refuted this idea and said, no, Islamic law has to be based in texts. Therefore, in the early period of Islam, there were competing epistemologies of Sunnah that jostled for power. Since early jurists wanted their law to conform with Quran and Sunnah, this became an extremely contentious religious issue. Legal knowledge was tied to piety and stores of religious knowledge, which became a defining feature of Islamic law. Okay. The Ahl Ra'i saw themselves as following a continuous tradition whose origin lie with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so it is difficult to reserve the word traditionalists for the Ahl al-Hadith exclusively. Likewise, the Ahl al-Hadith had an epistemology that they reasoned into existence, so to say, and used rational arguments to argue for the supremacy of textual hadith to be sunnah. Therefore, it is also hard to solely reserve the word rationalists for the Ahl Ra'i. Like many other academics, I find the word traditionalist or rationalist less than satisfactory. These two factions, the Ahl Ra'i and Ahl al-Hadith, appear to predate later sectarian terminologies like Sunnī, Shīʿī, Ibāḍī, and so on, likely containing what might be called the proto-Sunnis, proto-Shia, and proto-Ibāḍis, or proto-Khawarij, in a sense. Although these two camps were not usually hostile to each other physically most of the time, and their debates bore a lot of animosity in the later 8th century. Thanks again for watching my YouTube channel. I want to ask you to donate to my Patreon if you can, if you're able to, so that I can keep making these videos and be able to make them much more sophisticated for you and dedicate more time to them. Please also check out my Facebook page, Hamza the Historian. You can also find me on Twitter. Please check out my other video series. I just did a video series on the history of the Mu'tabirun movement, which might be called a Sufi movement or mystical movement in Islamic Spain. And please support me and more videos to come. I want to hear what you guys are interested in. I want to know what future videos you guys want to see. So please put comments down below and let me know what it is that you want to see from my channel, and I can, make note of that and try to come out with some videos on those topics. Thank you very much for watching, and please subscribe for more videos and give my video a like.